You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is Friday, April 5th, 2024. I'm very fortunate today to have a distinguished panel to discuss Timur Kuran's new book, and Freedom Delayed. And we're going to go as follows. Timur's going to have a chance to present a introduction to his book and lay it out, the basic themes. And then we'll hear from Jim Robinson and then Jennifer Murtzasvili. Timur Kuran is a professor of economics and political science at Duke University. Jim Robinson is a professor of economics and political science at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And Jennifer Murtzasvili is a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh and the director of the Center for Governance and Markets. We also are going to hear from my colleague, Mark Koyama, who's a professor of economics in the Department of Economics here and the director of the undergraduate PPE program. So without any further delays from me, Timur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pete. It's an honor to be on the Hayek Program podcast and on this panel of distinguished scholars. The Middle East is a highly troubled region politically. In practically every global index on political performance, it ranks way below the global average. It's extremely repressive by global standards. Even within the Muslim world, the Middle East is a poor performing region. Now, to give examples of indices where this pattern holds, the Middle East is a very poor performer according to the Civil Liberties Index of Freedom House, the Rule of Law Index of the World Bank, religious freedom indicators of Pew, and various freedom of the press indices. The Middle East is an elastic term. For the purposes of this book, Freedom's Delayed, the Middle East consists of 24 countries, all 22 members of the Arab League, plus Iran, plus Turkey. Within the broader Muslim world, the Middle East stands out for having had, historically, the longest exposure to Islamic law, known also as the Sharia. This suggests that the region's historical institutions may shed light on its repressiveness today. The book's subtitle is Political Legacies of Islamic Law in the Middle East. That signals its emphasis on institutions embodied in classical Islamic law. In other words, the legal complex that took shape during the first 3 centuries of Islam, the 7th century to the 10th century. Certain classical institutions of Islam are key sources of the Middle East repressiveness today. Classical Islamic law governed many aspects of life. How do we know which historical institutions might have been critical? There are clues in headline-grabbing challenges from below to the Middle East's autocratic regimes. Repression fosters chronic discontent. Occasionally, the discontent boils over and protests erupt. In Iran, nationwide demonstrations broke out in 2022 when Mahsa Amini was tortured to death for showing hair in public. It took several months for the theocracy to restore order. The Arab Spring that started in late 2010 is another such eruption. Major protests broke out across the Arab world. Now, there's a difference between these two episodes. The Arab Spring toppled several dictators, but the Ayatollahs running Iran's theocracy have survived. But it's the commonalities that give us a key clue. The Arab Spring and the Mahsa Amini protests were both spontaneous eruptions from below. No organization started them or directed them. In the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood is the exception that proves the point. For decades, it was Egypt's largest organization outside of state control. It stayed on the sidelines until President Mubarak threw in the towel. Some dissident organizations formed during the protests using social media, but they didn't last. In Iran, regime opponents around the world waited for some leader to emerge, for some organization to take charge, to become the protesters' collective voice and their coordinator. And it didn't happen. Contrast this lack of organization with the George Floyd protests or the pro-life movement on abortion. In these cases, organizations with a long history played, or they still play, critical roles in directing protests, in strategizing, and in converting opportunities into collective gains. Evidently, private organizational capacity, as opposed to state capacity, is weak in the region. A second commonality is that in each episode, the masses cried out for more freedoms. Iranian protesters wanted hijab for women, in other words, modest Islamic dress, to be voluntary. Most were not anti-headscarf. They wanted women to be free to decide, and they marched against repression generally. They wanted free speech, freedom of association, free elections, and broader religious freedoms, including the freedom to exit Islam. The themes were similar in the Arab Spring, with more emphasis on political freedoms. Now, freedoms delayed shows that these commonalities have historical roots. Let's start with the weakness of private organizational capacity. What historical institutions might have mattered to its development over time? One is the legal infrastructure for NGOs or non-government organizations generally. Another is commercial organization, because commercial organization affects the capacity of merchants to engage in collective action. Up to the 19th century, the Middle East's private commercial sector operated under Islamic law. It consisted of small, simple, and short-lived enterprises. I've discussed in a 2011 book, The Long Divergence, why indigenous Middle Eastern enterprises didn't scale up, and why, in the industrial era, this became an economic handicap that made the Middle East a laggard in industrializing. It's the political consequences that matter here in freedom delayed. Ephemeral Middle Eastern enterprises could not form business associations to bargain collectively with the state, as large firms in Western Europe were doing already in the centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution. So the commercial sector did not contribute to constraining the state, in other words, to developing political checks and balances, nor did they acquire the power to constrain clerics who interpreted the rules under which merchants operated, in other words, Islamic law. The commercial sector didn't contribute to strengthening what we now call civil society. Until the era of Westernization, there's no equivalent in Middle Eastern history of merchants sitting in parliament or of merchant associations bargaining with the state on behalf of leading firms. Let's move now from profit-making enterprises to charitable NGOs. A century after Muhammad, Islam developed a form of trust known as the Waqf. The Waqf was conducive to supplying social services autonomously from the state. In The Long Divergence, I discussed how tens of thousands of Waqfs that delivered services efficiently at their founding became dysfunctional over time. The institution of the Waqf contributed to keeping the Middle East economically underdeveloped through this mechanism, in other words, by locking capital into inefficient uses. Again, in freedoms delayed, it's the lasting political consequences that matter. A Waqf is founded by an individual, never a group, to finance in perpetuity through an endowment services stipulated by the founder. The stipulations are irrevocable and in principle, often in practice as well, unmodifiable. Waqf assets were considered sacred, which made them secure in an environment where private property rights were weak. Any service legitimate under Islamic law could be founded through a Waqf, including providing steady income for oneself and one's family. So Waqfs could serve as a wealth shelter. Vast resources flowed into Waqfs for this reason alone. Now, as a vehicle for financing social services, the Waqf was the Middle East's counterpart of the charitable corporation in the West. Western universities and churches were corporations. As such, they were self-governing. Their Middle Eastern counterparts, madrasas and mosques, operated according to their founder's instructions long after the founder was dead. In the medieval West, urban services were provided mainly by local governments, which were chartered as corporations. In the Middle East, urban services were provided by Waqfs. Waqfs came to control vast resources securely. On that basis, they might have constrained the state by resisting policies harmful to their constituencies. And the resulting decentralization might have placed the Middle East on the road to liberalization. In Western Europe, cities, guilds, and universities, which were organized as corporations, served exactly that political function. In constraining central governments, they became, over time, agents of liberalization. However, for all their wealth, Waqfs remained politically powerless. They didn't lead movements. They didn't generate ideologies to support constraining rulers. This is a key point. Waqfs remained powerless, and this was for several reasons. Unlike a corporation, a Waqf had no standing in court. Under Islamic law, Waqfs could not use their resources for political ends. That would be treated as sedition, illegal under Islamic law. European cities and churches, by contrast, participated in politics. Waqfs did not. The constituents of a corporation could replace a poorly performed leader. City dwellers could replace a mayor, for example. But a Waqf's caretaker was not accountable to his constituents. And constituents had no way of replacing him. Under the law, Waqfs were not allowed to form coalitions, as this would involve uses of income in ways unauthorized by the founder. So in Middle Eastern history, we find no lasting coalitions among Waqfs. There were no federations of Waqfs, no associations of school Waqfs, or anything similar. Nothing equivalent to the European coalitions among city administrations that fulfilled the roles of Waqfs. If coalitions had formed, some of them may have gained permanence. Checks and balances would have emerged. The bottom line is, in the Middle East, the suppliers of social services never became political players, let alone powerful players, nor did they foster political movements or ideologies. To come back to the present, the paucity of established civic players in the Arab Spring and the Iran protests is not a new pattern. The Middle East entered the modern era with a very weak civil society. Its peoples had not developed the civic skills needed to start and sustain liberalization campaigns or to establish checks and balances. Checks and balances, of course, bring to mind the division of powers in democratic states. But divisions of powers don't emerge out of the blue. Civil society needs to strengthen first. The West liberalized and democratized through struggles involving universities, cities, religious orders, and guilds, all organized as corporations. These corporate players challenged political power structures. They developed ideologies supportive of personal rights and associational rights. Western liberalization processes followed various trajectories. No two are the same, but they share two features. First, they involve pushes from below by privately organized constituencies that stand up to the state, constrain it, and influence the state's priorities. Second, ideological constraints on individuals weaken, allowing them to break intellectual taboos and think outside the box. This ideological and intellectual relaxation that develops in the course of liberalization and strengthening of civil society involves religious liberalization in one form or another. This brings us to another historically rooted institutional hindrance to liberalization generally and religious liberalization specifically in the Middle East, Islam's apostasy and blasphemy laws. These are still enforced to one degree or another by all Middle Eastern governments, but also socially. Apostasy and blasphemy laws constrain public discourse. They hinder liberal interpretations of Islam and the development and spread of liberal ideologies generally. Most critical, I think, they block liberal schisms within Islam. What's a religious schism? It's a religion's formal separation into variants with their own officials, their own doctrines, their own rituals, their own property, etc. Islam has had schisms. Sunnism and Shiism emerged early in Islamic history within Islam's first century as Islam's two major branches. For a much more recent example, ISIS emerged a decade ago as a puritanical, intolerant, and violent variant of Islam, openly violent variant of Islam, one that puts suspected apostates to death. Schisms are seen in other religions as well. Protestant schisms are frequent. Often they involve the splitting off of relatively liberal congregations from conservative ones. In the 19th century, East European Judaism spawned a stricter variant of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, but also a looser variant, Reform Judaism. Here's what makes Islam stand out among its sister Abrahamic religions. There have been many puritanical Islamic schisms, but not one liberal schism. Sure, there are liberal Islamic manifestos. There are books that derive a liberal interpretation of Islam from Islamic scriptures. But no Muslim liberal thinker has produced a movement that spawns a new denomination with its own mosques, its own rituals, its own property. There's no Islamic counterpart to Reform Judaism or to Protestant schisms. Sufism might seem like a counterexample, but its focus is on personal purification, not social liberalization. So why this asymmetry? Why schisms for greater strictness, but none for liberalization? It's not obvious why there's no Islamic counterpart to, let's say, Reform Judaism. This is a puzzle, especially since, as in Christian Europe, the Middle East has had sustained movement to suppress clerics. Secularization in the early Turkish Republic is the boldest of such movements, but the 20th century saw other secularization movements in Iran, Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. The Middle East secular regimes might have facilitated exits from Islam. They might have reinterpreted the Quran. They might have broadened religious freedoms generally. Instead, and largely for fear of being accused of apostasy or blasphemy, secularists simply made it easy to ignore Islam. Their ideal was to have citizens disconnect themselves from religion. They believed that religion would fade through economic development. Secular Middle Eastern regimes persecuted the pious as obscurantists, and they constricted discourses on modernizing Islam, again, for fear of being accused of apostasy or blasphemy. They succeeded for a while in pushing religion outside the views of elites, largely through repression, but religion did not fade. Instead, it became a refuge for diverse dissenters. Now, the absence of liberal Islamic schisms is not for lack of demand. There's wide dissatisfaction with prevailing interpretations of Islam. On gender and family, there's discontent with what counts as properly Islamic. Rituals are alienating huge numbers from Islam. Rituals such as animal sacrifices, fasting, mosque services, many more. The politicization of religion corrupts it, and that also alienates. All these various alienated constituencies are candidates for joining a liberal variant of Islam, should it emerge. The constituencies overlap, of course, the various constituencies I've described. But liberal Muslims, Muslims favoring a liberalization, at least of Islam, are unorganized outside of intellectual circles. Yes, they might join riots, but they aren't part of a sustained movement that strategizes, has a command structure, that openly demands a liberal variant of Islam. Why this contrast? Two asymmetries are involved, I'd suggest. The first builds on points made already. Religious illiberals are organized within existing and state-supported religious structures, mosques, religious orders, Quran school networks, and so on. But liberals must get organized from scratch without state support, and the required skills are poorly developed for historical reasons. The second asymmetry involves coercion. Religious illiberals are used to deploying coercive measures. They're ready to accuse liberals of apostasy and blasphemy. They're ready to punish liberals for these crimes, alleged crimes. By contrast, religious liberals are afraid of being charged with religious crimes, and they are intrinsically opposed to settling conflicts through violence. Now, these two asymmetries are delaying, I would suggest, the liberalization of Islam, and let me underscore delaying. There's no absolute barrier to avoiding temporal punishment for offenses against Islam or alleged offenses against Islam. Liberal readings of the Quran and Islamic precedents exist. Islam has been reinterpreted, and radically so, in the past. Starting in the early 1900s, the corporation in both its forms, nonprofit corporations as well as profit-seeking corporations, became fixtures of the legal system everywhere in the region. And this happened with little resistance from clerics. The Waqf itself was a huge innovation made just 1 century after Muhammad. It's not mentioned in the Quran, and its roots lie in Roman and Persian institutions. The obstacles to liberalization that I've described lead me to conclude in the book that there's no quick fix to the Middle East's repressiveness. Freedoms are delayed, though, not blocked. The book's optimism for the more distant future comes from reforms of the past 150 years, whose significance I think is not well appreciated. The Islamic Waqf is defunct. Throughout the region, charitable and business corporations exist. Yes, civil society remains weak, and yes, autocracies, whether religious or secular, have an interest in keeping civil society weak. But here's where the glass is half full. The legal infrastructure for an effective civil society is already in place, and civil society is developing. There exist firms that act together through professional organizations. Even in the most repressive regimes of the region, there are civic organizations that exercise power far greater than that of any Waqf ever exercised. So sustained liberalization is more likely now than a century ago. Besides, constituencies for a liberal variant have grown massively. Various forms of liberalization, I should point out, are interrelated. If religious liberalization gets underway, it can trigger liberalization on other fronts. Thank you.
I'm very happy to have the opportunity to give comments on Timur's great book, Freedom Delayed. The book has been long awaited, I think. The Long Divergence, so Timur Quran's earlier book on the economy, the economic history of the Middle East, is actually one of my all-time favorite economic history books. Whenever I teach a class, my undergraduate class in economic history, it's always one of the most popular readings. So I've been looking forward to Freedom Delayed for a long time. I was part of Makeda's book manuscript we ran back in 2019. So it's fantastic to see all this work come to accumulation. And I think even when I read The Long Divergence back when that was published around 2011, I think some of the arguments in Freedom Delayed had already been foreshadowed. So at the time The Long Divergence was published, Timur was clear that it would have a twin study. So Long Divergence was about the economic quote-unquote failure of the Middle East, the failure both to have an indigenous industrial revolution during the golden age of Islam, and then the failure or relative failure of the Middle East to then import the institutions and infrastructure of industrialization after 1800, after the Industrial Revolution had brought sustained economic growth to Western Europe and its offshoots. So this is a twin to that book. It's a study of the failure of liberal and constitutional government to emerge in the Middle East, and it very much complements our his earlier interest in the failure of regions to develop economically. Now, Freedom Delayed is a rich and dense book. A short summary can't do it justice. I'm going to briefly outline some of its main arguments, but by no means can I cover the entirety of the book. So what I think is great about Timur's work in general, and Freedom Delayed is no exception, is that he provides a very rich, layered set of institutional arguments. So institutional analysis is attractive to a lot of scholars in economics and economic history because it provides a mixture of structural and contingent arguments. So it outlines kind of structures, incentive structures, which are deeply rooted in the society, but which then govern our behavior. And that explains why things are difficult to change. So it's difficult for political actors or agents or individuals in the Middle East to liberalize their own societies because they're responding to institutions which have deep historical roots. But at the same time, it's not deterministic. It's not like saying, something is fixed and it's going to doom you forever, because institutions can change. And so it allows the possibility of change and contingency as well. So that's why an institutional account like Timur's is, I think, a very attractive one to scholars, myself included. So, and The Long Divergence, Timur's earlier book also provided an institutional argument. That provided an institutional account for why the transition from personal to impersonal trade and exchange was delayed in the Middle East. Freedom Delayed, however, is moved by moving away from kind of the business side of things, moving away from this impersonal personal trade distinction, is actually setting out to address and answer a much more complex set of questions, because it's seeking to explain why the Middle East remains one of the most unfree and illiberal parts of the world today. So this is a huge question. I mean, a lot of people, even people who don't normally read scholarly books or academic articles, will be interested in this question. And the first achievement, I think, of Freedom Delayed is it does a fantastic service in laying out the scope of a challenge, a scale of the problem. So there's a lot of survey evidence. There's data showing us that indeed the Middle Eastern countries are particularly repressive, on issues of freedom of speech. They're particularly undemocratic. They're very liberal on gender rights. They're very illiberal on religious freedom. So in many Middle Eastern countries, people cannot convert out of Islam. That's punishable, and they cannot criticize Islam. So there's a lot of blasphemy laws. And so I think setting out the scale of the problem and demonstrating that the Middle East as a region is particularly unfree is itself kind of an important contribution. So Freedom Delayed does a great job of outlining the scale of the challenge. Nonetheless, I think the complexity and the magnitude of this question is really daunting. And so my assessment, I think, of Freedom Delayed is it's a vital piece of work, and it provides vital kind of clues or hypotheses about why the Middle East remains unfree. But it's asking too much of any one book to imagine that it's going to provide like a full solution or comprehensive answer to these questions. So Timur in this book makes really important headway in setting out the dimensions of a problem and then outlining kind of a deep and rich set of arguments for why the Middle East faces these unique challenges and how it might get out of these challenges. But by no means is the argument settled. So this is going to be great in terms of laying out scope for future research, both Timur's research and also other scholars as well. So to reiterate, this problem is sometimes, people know the Middle East is undemocratic. And so, going back almost 20 years now to the time of the Iraq War, it's commonly understood that there's a lack of democracy in the Middle East. But of course, and as Timur makes very clear, it's a much deeper problem than a lack of democracy. Actually, electoral government is quite popular in the Middle East. What's not popular is liberalism. So what's not popular is a liberal constraints on the state and liberal rights for individuals. So there's a common perception in the Middle East that the state is basically a vehicle for ambitious individuals to advance themselves, for dominant groups to enrich themselves and to benefit their kin and kind of do harm to their enemies. And so what's lacking is the idea of an open society. And that's precisely what kind of Timur's book is about explaining why we have this absence. So my first kind of more challenging or critical comment is to say that it's precisely because this is such a big question, such an important question, that we don't even really have a consensus on how liberal constitutional orders emerged in the West. So we don't know really fully, deeply, why Western Europe and then its offshoots like the United States became liberal. So one of the most compelling recent hypotheses is that advanced by Joseph Heinrich in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, which I'll get back to in my other comments. But there are other explanations as well, like a whole suite of rich explanations, but we don't agree upon them. So, for example, many scholars focus on the role of ideas. So sometimes people focus on the role of, say, Christianity, other times for Reformation, other times for Enlightenment. So alternatively, depending on who you're talking to, the origins of individualism or Western liberalism or Western freedom could be tracked back to St. Paul, to Martin Luther, or John Locke, basically. So you have a whole suite of different individuals who might have had the key ideas which gave rise to liberal society. And then within economics and economic history, people tend to focus more on institutions, material interest in institutions, rather than ideas per se. And there, of course, you've got the work of Douglas North. His early work is more focused on the economic side of things, but as everyone in this podcast will know very well, his 2009 book with John Wallace and Barry Weingast actually does focus on civil society organizations in the transition to an open access order. And that's something which is obviously very pertinent to Timur's argument in Freedom Delayed. And Darren Acemoglu and Jim Robinson have important work on the relationship between the state and civil society. So I'm thinking particularly of their more recent book, The Narrow Corridor, about the strength of society. Similar ideas about civil society organizations being important because they can constrain the state. I think it's very complementary to what Timur's saying. So none of these alternative stories about the West or why Europe became liberal are contradictory to Timur's story, but the fact that there's a lot of disagreement there suggests that if we don't fully know why Europe became liberal, it's hard to say what's the silver bullet for the Middle East. And that makes it difficult, I think, to agree upon the diagnosis, and then the prescriptions for Middle Eastern society. So as I'll get to Timur's argument, really focuses on civil society organizations. We can agree that's important, but is that the critical thing? Is that the most important missing institution in the Middle East, or is it something else? I think part of the disagreement is that we don't necessarily even know the timing of when did liberal institutions emerge in Europe and its offshoots. So some scholars will go back to the Middle Ages and they'll see the roots of the divergence in the Middle Ages. So they'll look at the city-states of medieval Europe, of Italy. They'll look at constitutional arrangements like Magna Carta in Europe and think that really something distinctive emerges in the West in the Middle Ages. I think Timur's story is kind of quite consistent with that. But other scholars, a lot of historians, for example, will point out to all kinds of restrictions we see in 19th and even 20th century Europe. So, people going to jail for innocuous violations of freedom of speech in the 20th century. And so many aspects, Europe looks quite illiberal in the 19th century. So in that case, the divergence is more recent. And then maybe, back a more recent view of this divergence will give rise to a different set of diagnostics for why the Middle East remains illiberal. I would add, and this is not really a criticism of Timur, it's just a scope for future research, that we also don't know why there are non-Western liberal democracies. So a notable one is Japan. So Japan is, maybe not quite liberal by US standards, but it's a liberal democracy by global standards. Yet we don't know why, in some sense. We don't know quite how Japan was able to converge to the extent that it has converged to the West on liberalism and on having a stable democracy. Yet it doesn't have a lot of other ingredients. It doesn't have independent city-states, doesn't have Christianity. So that's another puzzle which we don't understand. And so this is all kind of sets out how big the problem is for Timur to propose solving it in one book is perhaps it would be too much for us to ask or expect. Similarly, when does this emergence of liberalism become irreversible? Could it have been reversed in the 16th century? Could it have been reversed by, say, the rise of fascism and Nazism or communism in the 20th century? These are all kind of open questions. So let's get to Timur's specific arguments. I'm going to focus more on the long legacy of Islamic Waqf. That's the first part of Timur's book. I'll only briefly talk about his arguments about religious pluralism here for sake of time. So one of the main strands of the argument in Freedoms Delayed is on the absence of civil society organizations in the modern Middle East due to the long legacy of the Islamic Waqf. And the Waqf is an organizational form, unlike others, which was used to shelter wealth in the Middle East. So rich people could basically shelter their assets from expropriation by the Sultan or by the secular ruler by putting them in a Waqf. But that meant that they were, while safe from the state, they were very inflexible, very difficult to reallocate these resources to any other task beyond that originally stated in the document of the founding Waqf. So these institutions are very kind of widely prevalent in the Middle East, and they crowd out other organizational forms which do not then emerge, partly because other Islamic institutions like the Islamic inheritance system and other aspects of Islamic law, the lack of legal personhood for corporations, mean that other institutions don't emerge. So, for example, a Waqf could be used to fund a school, but what you don't get in the Middle East are things like the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which basically have their own independent corporate identity, or city-states like London, which also have their independent corporate identity. So as a result of a Waqf, Quran argues that basically from the 8th to the 18th century, you have a very impoverished civil society in the Middle East. You don't get other institutions which mediate the relationship between the individual or the family and the state. And this long legacy basically means that there's no vehicle through which individuals can stand up against the state. Now, the challenge he faces is these Waqfs have basically disappeared a long time ago, and the argument then has to be that they've left a legacy of impoverishment of civil society. So some kind of a legacy whereby there haven't been long-standing institutions through which you can invest resources to oppose the state, and there isn't a cultural values which support kind of involvement in NGOs or so on. And then I would say Timur is very keen to argue that, a big part of his argument is that it's these Islamic institutions which emerged in the 7th or early 8th century, so emerged after the origins of Islam, which really constrain the development of liberalism, as opposed to the tenets of Islam itself. So his argument is always that Islam itself is not necessarily incompatible with liberalism, but these Islamic legal institutions are. But these Islamic legal institutions could be reformed. So an obvious example is the prohibition on interest, or riba, which has been basically bypassed by Islamic banking. Zakat is another Islamic legal institution where Timur shows that basically this has been changed over time. So he wants to argue that many aspects of Islam could be changed if only you could get a grip on the reforming the actual institutions which uphold this Islamic kind of set of Islamic institutions, as opposed to moving away from Islam itself. And so that's the strain of the main argument he has. The second argument he really focuses on is the absence of religious schisms, or the absence of liberal Islamic schisms in Islam. So he thinks Islam could become more liberal. It's a key argument, but it hasn't become so. And so another aspect of the argument would be, if Islam is to become more liberal, it would have to have some kind of liberal variant of Islam emerge, and this could be this is in his view kind of possible, and it could happen. But the absence of this has basically pushed people either towards the secularists, who often use the power of the state to oppress pious Muslims, or it's pushed them in the hands of the Islamicists, who want Islam to totally dominate all aspects of the economy and society, and which is obviously incompatible with any form of liberal or open access social order. And so in laying out this kind of argument, other stories, other explanations are then set aside. So, for example, European colonialism is set aside because it's basically ephemeral. It's too late to explain this divergence. And some countries like Turkey were never colonized. And then also European colonization actually spread liberal values in many cases. Timur also argues that the modern state in the Middle East is not a good explanation for this. So it would be a straightforward story to say Islamic societies like Iraq or Iran have had very repressive secular states, or religious states now, but secular states under the Shah in Iran. And these states have repressed civil society and repressed individuals. And so that's true, but Timur's story is that's a downstream consequence of the longer institutional story he's focusing on. So to sum up, Freedom Delayed lays out this institutional account with a lot of conceptual weight placed on the WATs, and then a secondary focus on the absence of schism as an account for why later, after 1800, Middle Eastern societies don't liberalize. So civil society doesn't emerge, parliaments are weak, political parties are weak, kinship networks dominate, the state is repressive, and liberal forces never really emerge. But I feel that while he considers some alternative explanations, there are other alternative explanations which are kind of left on the table that I think are going to need to be brought into the argument as the conversation develops. So to take one briefly, the importance of cousin marriage is mentioned by Timur briefly, I think on page 104, 105. So cousin marriage is very prevalent in the Middle East, and he argues it's a correlate of the low trust environment that we see in the Middle East. And so I think Timur's thinking is that the widespread prevalence of cousin marriage might be downstream of the long history he documents in his book. But I think he should mention other explanations. So I'm thinking about Jonathan Schultz's work published in the Economic Journal, and also Joe Heinrich's work about basically tight kinship groups and cousin marriage as a causal factor in the failure of civil society institutions to develop in the Middle East. So that's actually an alternative hypothesis to the one advanced in Freedom Delayed. I also think, and this is kind of one of my final concluding points, I think that the argument in the future is going to be strengthened if we can look at other non-European societies which have either liberalized or failed to liberalize, and if they lack or have institutions kind of comparable to the civil society institutions Timur thinks are so important in the West. So I briefly mentioned Japan as a non-Western, non-Christian society, but which is yet a broadly or moderately successful liberal democracy. And I think this is supportive of Timur's story, but actually in Japan you do have extremely long-lived institutions dating back many centuries, in some cases over 1,000 years in Japan, which, they don't necessarily constrain the state, but they provide a means of organization beyond the family. And so more evidence like that taken from other societies, I think, will really strengthen the arguments developed in freedom delayed. Now, I think so. One of the most kind of challenging topics I think raised by this book is the role of Islam itself. Timur is very keen to argue that it's not Islam itself; it's these institutions around Islam which are responsible. So that's an optimistic take. So it's going to be attractive to people because it says you can keep Islam in some sense and attain prosperity in a liberal open access order. So that's a story I think all of us would want to be true, but wanting it to be true doesn't necessarily make it true. And so one of the challenges I think he's going to face is kind of explaining more why there aren't liberal schisms in the Middle East and in Islam. So one brief point would be that there's no equivalent to magisterium which in the Catholic Church, which is important in terms of determining doctrine. So in the case of the Catholic Church, the Second Vatican Council is very important in making Catholicism and liberalism compatible, but you can't imagine something similar in Islam. It seems like what you get is either secularization, where people leave Islam, or you get people attracted to Islamism. And so I think Timur is absolutely correct to think that a liberal variant of Islam would be a critical, vital ingredient in spreading more liberal ideas in the Middle East and making those societies more flourishing, more prosperous, and kind of, happier places to live in. But how does that happen? That's left to me an open question, which I don't think we have good answers to. So with that, I think I'll leave my remarks. Just to say, finally, I wanted to thank Timur for writing such an excellent book. It's kind of it really lays the groundwork for thinking about these questions. So it's precisely because the book has so many ideas in it. It's very richly, densely sourced. You learn a huge amount, I think, from reading it. But one has a lot of questions and puzzles going forward. So I just wanted to congratulate him on the publication of it and on its success.
Jim, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to have this chance to discuss Timur's book. And I should just say, there's so much in this book. Actually, it's like we can't do justice to it. When I ripped up my notes several times because I couldn't decide what I was going to talk about because there's so many ideas and kind of themes in the book. So let me have a go at three different sort of topics just to be provocative. And I guess the first one is, do we think it's true, or maybe do I think it's true, that everybody wants liberalism and a liberal state? There's a sort of presupposition, it seemed to me, that having a liberal state or a liberal society is something desirable, and it's what people want. It's just because of this history, this institutional history that Timur was sort of outlining there, they can't get it because they don't have the organizational capacity to do it. The Arab Spring starts, but people can't find common ground, and it all disintegrates, and then a very illiberal project emerges. But I wonder, looking around the world today, or even historically, whether it's true that there is such a demand for liberalism. I was just in Zimbabwe last week, and I had dinner with a very good friend of mine who is a big activist in the movement for democratic change, fighting for democracy against President Mugabe and now President Mnangagwa. And I have to say that he's completely given up now. He's totally given up. He's been in prison. He's been tortured. He's been beaten up. And he looked at me and he said, people just like to be told what to do. That people like to be told what to do. And it seemed to me like, we're in the history of successful illiberal models. Like, look at China. In China, there's no history of liberalism or any of these kind of institutions you're talking about. There's no history of accountability or representation or checks and balances. And it's been like that for a heck of a long time, and there's even a completely different sort of intellectual tradition of how you achieve good governance, and how, you rectify yourself, and and that spreads out through the community. And I'm sure you all heard about that. So I think my first question is, like, it's not obvious to me, that there is such a demand. People are content to live in illiberal societies, and they can adjust to that, and they can find that to be a legitimate way of organizing things. I know you give these examples, from Iran and people protesting, and of course there's a distribution, but I wonder what proportion of society that really is. And I think my second point is, looking forward, in the Middle East, I would say, for me, the hegemonic model is the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates has done something extraordinary. It's created a modern society in a completely non-democratic and illiberal context. I'm not quite sure anyone knows how they've done that. It's very badly studied. To the extent I understand it, it's that they were able to take traditional kind of, I don't know, you'd call them very liberal, but traditional tribal social structures and sort of use that as a way of providing order in a modern state, by merging them with modern institutions. There's a very interesting book by historian Christopher Davidson about the construction of the state in Abu Dhabi in the 1970s, where he sort of shows that, they took these different tribal associations and then they just gave each one a ministry. So somebody got the Ministry of Finance, and someone got the Ministry of Education, someone got the and you look at that, you read it, and you think, how could that possibly work? It's about the most non-Weberian thing you've ever heard of in your entire life, but somehow it works spectacularly. And the model is spreading. What's Saudi Arabia doing other than adopting the UAE model of how to organize things? And that UAE is everywhere in Africa now. It's one of the biggest investors in Africa. So I think we've all been in denial, with China for decades. And now we're all going to be in denial with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But I guess as a social scientist, I have to think, maybe there's some completely illiberal, very functional order of a sort that we didn't think was possible historically. We've kind of thought, to be successful, you need to have these underpinning, these political institutions and a certain type of society that's going to foster creativity and inclusion and innovation. But I think when I look at the world, today, I see, there's very different models, flourishing that seem extremely difficult to understand from our perspective. And that makes me think we don't understand it because we just don't have the right concepts for thinking about, people's motivations and people's worldview and how they think about it. So, and I guess my third point was, I really enjoyed the book, and I don't know the Middle East. I'm not a scholar of the Middle East. So I compared it to places, compared the arguments to places that I know more about, especially in sub-Saharan Africa where I've worked. And, if you ask me, why has sub-Saharan Africa been so autocratic since independence? Why has it been so difficult to sort of support liberal political regimes? There's a lot of illiberalism in sub-Saharan Africa. Think about people's attitudes towards homosexuality, for example. There's lots of illiberalism in that sort of sense. And I would think for me the kind of problem is to do with and I don't know if this resonates I can see some place it resonates in the Middle East, which I can talk about, but it may not resonate in other places like Egypt, for example, or Turkey. But I would say the problem in sub-Saharan Africa is just the terribly complicated political geography. You have so many small-scale societies with very different institutions, very different types of social contract, and it's been very hard to aggregate those or sort of agree on what norms and whose principles should govern national states. One of my favorite, and the national state is a sort of alien thing. Again, I don't know if this is true in the Middle East. It's a very different history, but one of my favorite Nigerianisms is that if you take the Igbo word for a civil servant, let's say you get a job in the national state in Abuja, and you're a civil servant, you're working for some ministry or something. The literal translation of that word into Igbo, is white man's job. So this is still a kind of alien thing, the state, like these national institutions, they're out of sync with the kind of society, and then that's a very difficult problem to solve. Now, I think, it's true, that there is a lack of civil society also in this sense. There's lots of kind of associational life, but it's not usually voluntary. You have to join. You have to be a member of the age set, or you have to be a member of your kindred, or you have to participate. It's not. There's a lot of there's a very dense kind of Putnam-esque social world, but it's not voluntary in this sense at all of the way we think about civil society. And so maybe that's very significant, in terms of, and of course it doesn't scale up also, it's very localized, it doesn't bridge different communities, doesn't bridge different societies, And I think if you thought about parts of Africa that had been successful, actually, they're not terribly liberal either, like Botswana. Botswana's been very successful because it was able to scale up these traditional institutions and make them functional with a modern liberal democratic state. But actually, if you look at it, it's not very liberal or democratic. The same political party's been in power since 1966. There are elections and there's, it's peaceful but it's peaceful because there's a kind of traditional order that organizes things. Look at Somaliland, one of the big success stories in Africa in the last 30 years. Again, there's an order there too, but it's based on clan structures. The whole Senate is built around clans and representing clans, and it's the traditional society and the traditional social structures that make the place so orderly and organized and stuff. So that's that's maybe more like the United Arab Emirates, in East Africa sort of thing. So I see these, non-liberal models kind of flourishing everywhere, and I see our own version of liberalism in Western countries massively under challenge and threat at the moment. So I guess when I read it, I really enjoyed so many different aspects of it, but I got very hung up on this delayed aspect. Is that really where we're heading at the moment? Is that really where the Middle East is heading? Or is it heading to some UAE model of successful illiberalism? Are we all heading in that direction? These are just some of the things that, the lines of thought that developed as I read the book.
Okay, Jen.
Okay, so this conversation is causing me to tear up all of my notes. In a very good way, because I think, let me just begin, with this book is really an impressive contribution to our understanding of the Middle East in general, to our understanding of democratic development, to our understanding of the way civil society develops. And, this reevaluation of the historical underpinning that have shaped, I think, the socio-political fabric of the Middle East, and really emphasizing the profound influence of Islamic law and institutions, especially over colonial legacies, is really quite important. And that's actually sort of where I want to begin some of my comments. So first, I would agree with Jim, who talked about the sort of teleological nature of liberalism. I think sometimes we have been caught up in our own mental traps of the way that we think societies and economies can develop, especially over the past 30 or 40 years. Entire fields of democratization have emerged based on a very short period of time with an understanding that societies should become more democratic, or why aren't they becoming more democratic, without pausing for a second to understand how democracy may be an aberration in many ways. That we thought that democracy would be this contagion that would, the end of history was upon us and then life would become very boring. And life has been anything but boring. And I think this book really points to the fact that there have been real struggles in the creation of a vibrant civil society in the Middle East. And the roots of this, as Timur points out, are in the Waqf and the evolution of the Waqf and how this Waqf has emerged over centuries. This is very important. And we see many roads not taken. For example, not only the Waqf, but in the book, there's discussion of Sufism, which could also play an important role in generating civil society, but doesn't. Sufism is often at odds with ruling parties. Political rulers are quick to castigate Sufi leaders, cast them aside, punish them, imprison them. But Sufi leaders also pursue this, ascetic lifestyles. They've, as Timur says, abjured temporal power. And so there is civil society, but civil society that maybe does not see the state as the center of power. This civil society looks to something else. and that modernizing Islamic states have almost always been at odds with these kinds of Sufi groups. So that tells you something about the nature of civil society, and maybe something larger is at stake. I think the book makes another very important contribution by eschewing colonial explanations. And Jim, this is where I was hoping to hear you push back a little more on the colonial origins of all of this. Scholarship is rife with discussion of decolonization, understanding the colonial roots of authoritarianism, and so forth. And so I think it's very important, that very important contribution is this book sort of pushes back on those narratives, because we get caught up in this kind of presentism. And I would argue that the liberal focus is a symptom of this presentism. Looking towards liberal institutions is kind of a symptom of this presentism, but also looking at colonial institutions is symptomatic of this, right? Because the colonial institutions, this is the last 150 years, we believe that these institutions are so important for shaping so many outcomes across the world, but it turns out they may not be as important as we think, which takes us back in time. And so Jim's comment about custom religion and the intertwining of custom religion and civil society really were sort of the hallmarks of things that I think are important and maybe could be built on, in subsequent works, and or maybe aren't dealt with in the book. I noticed that the word adat and urf are not mentioned. Maybe they were mentioned in earlier iterations, but I noticed that there wasn't a big discussion of custom. And it is difficult to look at the emergence of Islamic law throughout the Middle East and actually throughout the world. And it's not just Islam, it's the role of religion and society. It's very, very difficult to separate these two from one another. So the book rightly challenges, this presentism bias in contemporary scholarship by getting beyond colonialism. But I'm wondering if we forgot sort of the roots of many of the factors that played an important role in the evolution of Islamic politics, or politics in the Islamic world, that Jim has pointed out, right? That we see very clearly in places like the UAE, where we see these political bargains playing out. And so this is where tribes or different social groups, they really matter for politics. And I think the UAE is a perfect example of that. We can look at the Houthis, we can look at Pashtunwali. I know, Afghanistan is sort of beyond an example here, but custom really looms large. And indeed, many customary practices have been absorbed by Islamic law, but they're often at odds with them. And they are the source of a great deal of conflict and contestation throughout the Muslim world. And then, or the Middle East, I should say, because I want to make sure that I'm honoring the scope of this book. And this historical lens really helps us appreciate the forms and functions of civil society, that they're not universal, but they're deeply rooted in specific legal, cultural, and historical contexts. And by looking to the past, the book really invites us to envision new pathways for building civil society that really resonate more with traditions, values, and legal frameworks. And this perspective is really quite invaluable because it's telling scholars and policymakers and even civil society practitioners to think creatively about how to foster civic engagement and even social cohesion in ways that are culturally resonant and adaptable to contemporary challenges. But I would also note that the book really remains an important contribution to helping us understand the Middle East's political and social history. But it highlights the limitations, I think, of exporting Western models of NGOs and civil society to regions with very different historical and social contexts. And so, what I want to suggest is that the United States is often criticized for exporting Jeffersonian democracy to the rest of the world. And I think that is hardly the case. If we look at the way that the US exported democracy, it looks very different from Iraq to Afghanistan to different contexts. And this was hardly, the democratic institutions that were exported were hardly Jeffersonian. But what was consistent has been the way that I think the United States and Western Europe in particular have exported civil society. That civil society should have a particular form, it should look a particular way, it should be funded, there should be boards, there should be members, there should be flip charts, there should be all the accoutrements of a formal structure. And I think what the book points to is that civil society can look very different, but there is a real mismatch between structures of the state and the kind of civil society that needs to respond to it. So the state itself, throughout much of the modern Middle East, is a more recent technology. And having civil society emerge as a technology that really responds to the new technologies of the state, I think is still a work in progress. But I think it points to the fact that you can't have these sort of cookie cutter approaches to civil society for the very reason that Jim points out, that traditional organizations look very different. Maybe they're not voluntary organizations, but they still represent a very important source of social organization. And then finally, one aspect of the development of civil society that I think we are all underplaying is technology, is that civil society in the Middle East could easily leapfrog many parts of the world because people are on social media. You no longer need a formal organizational structure to organize. Young people don't want to be members of anything. So civil society can exist in Telegram groups and WhatsApp groups with in very spontaneous ways, in ways that are very self-organized. This was the great hope of the Arab Spring, right? That the Twitter revolution would engender a kind of political and social movement. But I think we're at the very early stages of understanding this kind of technology based, self organized civil society that is actually much more difficult for states to control. States wish to, think that they can control everything with Chinese surveillance technology, but I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that the Middle East is sort of at the precipice of this, and I think we're all at the precipice of this because we're seeing maybe the great convergence that we're seeing is the decline of civil society throughout the world, right? In Western democracies, we're seeing people organize less. We're seeing everyone's bowling alone. Why on earth would we expect to see the Middle East converge to a liberal norm or expectation when the rest of the world is actually turning its back on civil society? So I have a lot more to say, but I'll leave things there.
Okay, Tamar, it's back to you. Do you have any responses or questions you'd like to raise?
Yes, yes. I mean, these are extremely good comments, and I find a great deal to agree with. I should point out that I found this book more difficult to write than The Long Divergence, and more difficult to keep the page number down because there is so much that you can discuss. Perhaps Jim, who has also written about economic and political issues, has had the same experience. Now, liberalism, I completely agree that it's relative. And the puzzle of the book is that the Middle East is exceptionally illiberal along many dimensions within the Muslim world, but also within the wider world. Of course, I agree with Jim and Jen that nowhere are freedoms unbounded. Nowhere is there a perfect liberal order. And I completely agree that we're in a period when liberal societies themselves are becoming less liberal, including the United States. That was something happening as I was writing the book, and it made it, it did constitute a challenge. Nevertheless, the problem remains that the Middle East is an outlier. And as the rest of the world becomes more repressive, say with controls on the internet or press freedoms and so on, these affect the Middle East as well. Whatever states elsewhere use to restrict freedoms, same thing happens in the Middle East. Middle Eastern states use the same means, and it keeps, but the relative ordering then stays the same. Now, the question of whether there's a demand for liberalization. Now, if the question means, do we have a lot of Hayekian liberals in the Middle East? The answer is, of course, no. But there are lots of people who would like more freedom along one dimension or another. It doesn't mean that these people would like to extend freedoms across the board. But I would suggest that in some areas, and religion is one of them, the demand for liberalization even comes from conservatives. In the Iranian demonstrations, the Mahsa Amini protests, the protesters included conservatives, very pious Muslims. The protests occurred also in Qom, the center of religious conservatism in Iran. So the demand wasn't limited to westernized youths in the big city, people who have a generally Western lifestyle. So I would suggest that the demand for liberalization, religious liberalization at least, is greater than meets the eye. The regimes themselves pick this up in surveys meant to be classified, leaked surveys. They find again that there are various restrictions, religious restrictions, are generating discontent. Now, are there liberals who've given up? I think, Jim, this was one of your in the region. Yes, there's a lot of in many places. There's a lot of despair. It's still the demand is still there, and the demand is growing for a reason that Jen gave, is that people have access to social media and they see all the freedoms that people enjoy elsewhere. People can like to be governed by others. That is entirely true. I think it's universal in one sense. We all want government. We all want somebody who's going to establish rules, is going to enforce those rules even against us. But it's still relative. We can want that. People can want in the United States an autocrat to come and, if nothing else, repress the other 50%, the side that they don't like. They're still assuming that they will maintain certain freedoms. Now, establishing a liberal society is, of course, a very difficult thing, and in Europe, it took centuries for various constituencies to become powerful enough to establish a balance, to bargain with each other. It's not easy. In Europe itself, it didn't happen everywhere. In some places, they happened more fully than others. Eastern Europe never had the liberalization that Western Europe had. It's a very difficult process. It's easy to slip back, to lose freedoms. All that is correct, but it still leaves in place the question of why the Middle East is particularly repressive along many, many dimensions. And that is what the book tries to address, and sticking to that theme and not getting into many of these things is one of the challenges that I faced. Perhaps I should have added a couple of chapters on discussing these. That's for you to judge. Last thing, again, this relates to points that both Jim and Jen have made. There are, in fact, various ways of achieving checks and balances that will allow liberalism in one form or another to flourish. And yes, these can build on, as both of you have pointed out, these can build on local institutions. That's one of the things that I've thought that actually the book does address, that within Islam there are resources for liberalizing along various fronts. Now, whether the liberal order will look exactly like that in a Western country, I would say absolutely no, because institutions, local institutions, do persist. History does matter, and distant history matters. Of course, Middle Eastern countries are going to look different. Now, is the UAE the model of the future, or Saudi Arabia of the future? It remains to be seen. They are trying to contain the youths. I have my doubts as to whether Saudi Arabia will actually retain stability. right now they're able to buy off the dissidents and the tribes that object to the Al Saud's rule. We don't know what's going to happen to the price of oil in coming years. We don't know what the limited liberalization that MBS is trying to allow from above, what it's going to trigger, what unintended effects it's going to have. So I'm not convinced that this is actually going to be the model of the future. And let me add one more point. Jen's last point, that within the establishment of civil society, that the Middle East might be leapfrogging and provide in coming decades, generate a type of civil society that we can't even imagine now, right? This would happen in the West. Now, the Middle East would be starting this process of moving to a new equilibrium where modern technologies play a role. It would be starting from a more repressive base, from weaker civil society. So I would imagine, based on what I can see, based on my thinking so far, that whatever that equilibrium, whatever the new equilibrium is, there will be greater freedoms in parts of the world that have enjoyed some form of liberal order than in the Middle East. So let me stop there and let Jim and Jen come in.
Jim or Jen, do you have any follow-ups or?
I have some. So let me come back to this topic of colonialism then, since I was supposed to talk about colonialism. Apparently, I mean, isn't it interesting that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia were not European colonies? I mean, the United Arab Emirates, there was the trucial states, and but there wasn't much interference, in the society. And I think it's not a coincidence that Botswana, was basically never colonized. I mean, it was a protectorate, but it was never governed from Botswana, and indirect rule was never really implemented. And so I think if I was going to take the analogy to I think, well, Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, and why do those places exist? Or think about Libya, which is sort of disintegrated. Like Libya looks very much like a sub-Saharan African country. It's this merger together of these extremely different civilizations in the interior, on the coasts, that were never unified politically until the Italians kind of stuck them together and said, now you're Libya, now you're, so I do feel like, although I don't know the Middle East, I've never worked in the Middle East, I do feel like many of these problems, look similar to problems that you see in sub-Saharan Africa, and that you do have the same problem of trying to create a social contract in Syria, which is enormously diverse, sort of culturally and ethnically. And you have the state run by the Alawites, who are some kind of subset of the society who've kind of captured the state and the military. That has a very sort of African feel to it. So I do wonder, had colonialism not created Syria and Iraq or Lebanon, or whether there would be different dynamics. Although I agree with Jennifer very much about, like, I appreciated a lot in the book this kind of deeper historical argument about, that a lot of this actually was part of the consequences of the historical institutions that Timur is talking out. But I do think that's worth. When I didn't mention it, it wasn't that I was dismissing it.
It's important to recognize that Afghanistan was also never colonized too. So there's two sides of this coin. Right?
There you go. So let me say something about Afghanistan then. I just because I think Afghanistan is extremely interesting. I nowadays, when I teach political economy, I start out by talking about how the Taliban organized their state. Because I think, like, we have no way of thinking about that in political economy. This sort of theocracy and and like how, so I understand, that there's lots of repression and in Afghanistan or whatever, but I also think it's pretty plausible that there's a large number of people in Afghanistan who think this is a legitimate way of organizing a state. It's Islamic, it's highly illiberal, not democratic in any kind of conventional way. Maybe there are elements of democracy or accountability there somewhere in the structure I don't know enough about. But it seems to be like, why can't I have a non-liberal, legitimate kind of political state like that? It seems to me that's sort of exactly what you have in China. Of course, not everyone agrees in China. But, it's interesting. You must, like me, interact with these Chinese students all the time, PhD students, and it's very interesting, the reticence with which they're willing to engage on these topics. And of course, part of that you could say as well, there's people from the Communist Party at the University of Chicago, and you have to be extremely careful what you say, especially in public. But I think it's deeper than that, honestly. I think the way they think about this system is not the way we think about the system. And it has a logic and a legitimacy and a kind of functionality that we find it difficult to imagine.
So just very, very briefly, just to go back, to some of the discussions. I mean, I think we can definitely look at the oil well. I mean, UAE, we can explain many of these cases away, right? How the UAE is able to pay off its citizens in ways that the Iranians are not able to do, or the way that you're not able to see in many other regimes. So that vast wealth and the very small population gives, I mean, we don't want to explain each case away, right? But I just want to really applaud Timur for this work, because to me it pointed us back not to the role of the formal institutions, but to the role of civil society. And what it paints is a really important picture of how civil society emerged. I think the Waqf as an institution does not get enough attention. It is everywhere in the Muslim world, but yet it is nowhere. You hear about it so much, yet it's invisible. You read about it in the history books, yet it's omnipresence in its absence, right? And so it's wonderful to see the connection between this institution and civil society, and the lack of emergence of a civil society. And I really think that the crux of all of this is understanding what is a form of civil society. And this points to a past that shows us it can look somewhat different. It points us to, these critical junctures in history that reshaped the nature of civil society. But I think this is a very, very important contribution that allows us not just to understand the Middle East in new ways, but also helps us reimagine how we can understand what is civil society. So I want to thank you for that, Timur.
I think that's a very good point. I'm going to ask Timur to, wrap up things with a final word. But before that, I do think that Jim put a very fascinating challenge to all of us, which is the juxtaposition of liberalism suffering a legitimation crisis in the Western democratic societies, right? We have all kinds of issues that are associated from, economic policy issues like fiscal issues, sustainability, these other kind of issues, but also simply the legitimating ideology is no longer there. It's been eroded. You think about these things, right? I mean, there's a Harper Magazine symposium with McCloskey and Cornel West and Patrick Deneen and Fukuyama a year ago. And it was on, is liberalism worth saving? And everyone except for McCloskey said, no, it's run its course. It has its difficulties, things like that. And that's at the same time, while there's these alternative models, as Jim points out, that seem to be working. And so one of the advantages that we always had was liberalism is freedom and it works, rather than now everyone's like, what kind of freedom and for who? And is it really working? And so there's a real challenge there, I think, that, your book is a piece of the puzzle. Both of your books as companion volumes are a big piece of the puzzle. But we really have to come to grips with this challenge, I think, that Jim has put forward to us as social scientists. Because I think the implied message in the very beginning of his comment, not so hidden, but actually is that, our normative preferences for liberalism are not something to just be taken as granted. They have to actually be something that is argued for because of the world that we live in. Whereas in a previous time, they were just the default position. obviously liberal, and so it's for comparativists, it's a great time. For liberals, it's frustrating. So, but anyway, Timur, you have some comments. You want to just wrap things up?
Just very brief to wrap it up. First, I should point out that I'm beginning work on the modernization of the Middle East, focusing on the colonial shock and its repercussions down to today. So a lot of the things that you're discussing, and of course there, I will be looking at these various nuances and the various responses. Now, Jim and Jen, you gave examples of places that were not colonized and that have generated alternatives to a liberal order. Okay, you mentioned the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. Two other places that were not colonized are Iran and Turkey, where we had deep, very powerful attempts at secularizing these countries, crushing the clerics, and they generated, they were successful for a while. They generated massive responses, which we're living through right now, and those responses are generating counter responses. And so I think other places to look at, in addition to follow carefully, in addition to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, will be Iran and Turkey, that are also trying to develop their own alternative forms. And I should point out, lastly, that the secularists in Turkey and Iran today are much more willing to work with pre-existing institutions than the modernizers of the late 19th and early 20th century, who completely dismissed traditional Islamic institutions and simply thought that they could modernize their societies economically and politically by transplanting Western institutions. So I think coming decades will give us a lot of experimentation and of course, will give us as social scientists a lot to write about.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for your contributions this afternoon. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.